Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing amazing today. Buckle up, because we've got a shocking update straight from the heart of America. A story so intense, it's making headlines everywhere. You won't believe what just happened. Let's dive right in. Stay tuned. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was suffocating. The room was packed, reporters, spectators, police officers, and even local politicians. Everyone was here to witness what they believed would be an open and shut case. At the center of it all sat Kamala Harris, a composed black woman in a sharp navy blue blazer, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. Across the courtroom, Officer Bradley Simmons leaned back in his chair, an arrogant smirk stretching across his face. He had played this game before: fabricate a compelling testimony, paint the suspect as a violent criminal, and let the system do the rest. And today, his target was Kamala Harris. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, strode confidently to the podium. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying a rehearsed authority. "This case is straightforward. Officer Simmons, a decorated officer, was forced to defend himself against an unprovoked attack from the defendant. The evidence will show that she was aggressive, combative, and even attempted to seize the officer's weapon." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Simmons stood, walking to the witness stand with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He adjusted his uniform, stole a quick glance at his fellow officers in the back row, and then launched into his testimony. "She was loitering outside a closed business," he said, his voice steady. "I approached her to ask what she was doing there, and immediately, she became hostile. I tried to de-escalate, but she lashed out, striking me in the chest." A few people in the audience gasped. Kamala didn't flinch. She was watching, calculating, waiting, because Officer Simmons had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Kamala Harris rose from her seat with deliberate precision, smoothing out her blazer as she made her way to the witness stand. The entire courtroom was watching her now, not as a criminal, but as something else. Something dangerous. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and folded her hands neatly in front of her. Calm, collected, unshaken. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, approached with a smirk, eager to rip her apart. "Miss Harris, you just heard Officer Simmons's testimony. Do you dispute his account of the events?" Kamala tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "I don't dispute his account," she said evenly. "I'm stating, clearly, that he lied." A stunned silence settled over the room. Simmons's smirk faltered. Avery recovered quickly. "That's a bold accusation," he scoffed. "Do you have any proof?" Kamala leaned forward slightly. "The truth doesn't need to be bold. It just needs time to reveal itself." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Kamala let the tension build. "Let them feel it." Then, she turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to submit evidence that contradicts Officer Simmons's testimony." Judge Grayson, intrigued, adjusted his glasses. "What kind of evidence?" Kamala sat back, completely in control. "Video footage." The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, shock. Simmons's face drained of color. His fellow officers in the back row stiffened. Avery went rigid, his mind scrambling for a counterattack. Kamala had just cracked the first fault line in Simmons's perfectly constructed lie. The courtroom held its breath as the bailiff inserted the USB drive into the media system. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly, the truth that Simmons had been so sure he could bury began playing for everyone to see. The footage was shaky but clear enough, a cell phone recording from a bystander who had witnessed everything. On the screen, Kamala Harris stood calmly on the sidewalk, checking her phone. No aggressive behavior, no hostility, just a woman standing in a public space. Then, Officer Simmons appeared. His approach was not that of an officer looking to de-escalate. He was already reaching for her arm before she had even spoken. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." Kamala's voice rang out from the video, calm yet firm. "Why do you need my ID?" Then came the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp. Simmons shoved Kamala against the hood of his car, gripping her wrist too tightly. She didn't resist. She didn't fight. And yet, his voice was filled with pure arrogance and control as he spat out his next words. "Women like you need to learn how to obey." Boom. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, outrage, shock. Judge Grayson's gavel slammed down as the murmurs turned into a roar. The jury members exchanged horrified glances, and even the officers sitting in the back row began shifting uncomfortably. Simmons, who had been sitting tall and proud, now looked like a man drowning. His jaw clenched. His hands trembled. Kamala? She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, because she wasn't done yet. The uproar in the courtroom had barely settled when Kamala Harris calmly stood up. The room, once buzzing with chaos, fell into an eerie silence. Every eye was on her, not with doubt, but with a new sense of curiosity. She took a slow, measured step toward the witness stand. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, intrigued. "Miss Harris," the prosecutor sneered, clearly rattled but determined to regain control. "You expect this court to believe that Officer Simmons fabricated an entire incident?" Kamala exhaled softly. Then, she turned to face the jury and, with a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, she spoke. "I am not just Kamala Harris. I am Lieutenant Commander Kamala Harris, United States Navy SEAL, retired." The courtroom imploded. Gasps. Stunned silence. Shockwaves rippling through every person in the room. Simmons's face drained of all color. The smirk he had worn for most of the trial was completely wiped away. Judge Grayson, normally unshaken, sat back in his chair, blinking. Even the prosecutor lost his footing, his face a mixture of disbelief and sudden realization. Kamala let the weight of her words sink in. Then, she turned, her sharp gaze locking onto Simmons. "I have been trained to de-escalate high-risk situations. I have been in combat zones, leading men into battle. If I had wanted to be a threat to you, Officer Simmons, you wouldn't be standing here today." The room was frozen. Even the officers in the back row, who had come in support of Simmons, were now avoiding eye contact. Simmons? He looked like a man who had just realized he was already buried. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to suffocate. Kamala Harris, standing tall and unshaken, had just flipped the entire trial upside down. Officer Simmons was no longer the confident liar smirking at the stand. He was sweating, his hands clenched into fists, his knee bouncing uncontrollably. The walls were closing in. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The jury had seen the video. They had heard his lies unravel in real time. And now? Now they knew exactly who Kamala Harris was. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. His normally stoic face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that this case was far from the open and shut scenario he had expected. "The jury will now deliberate," he announced. But it didn't take long. 20 minutes later, they returned. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a steely gaze, stood up, her hands steady as she read the verdict. "In the case of State versus Kamala Harris, we find the defendant not guilty." The room erupted. Gasps. Cheers. Reporters scrambling for their phones. The world had just changed. But then, the forewoman continued. "Furthermore, we strongly recommend a formal investigation into Officer Bradley Simmons for misconduct, perjury, and excessive use of force." Boom. The final nail in his coffin. Simmons' mouth opened, but no words came out. His fellow officers, who had once sat behind him in support, slowly shifted away. Kamala turned, locking eyes with Simmons one last time. And then she walked out, free, undefeated, and unstoppable. Because justice? Justice had finally spoken.